But thank you for being here. We have Bishop Scott Barker from Nebraska, and Bishop Leo Frade, who has, I'm sorry, I went past Doug. Gosh. I can't go past Doug. He brought more people here than anybody else. I mean, let's give a big round of applause for Western Massachusetts. Doug Fisher from Western Massachusetts. Then Bishop Leo Frade, who just introduced me to, who's going to be my newest best friend, talking about a new program that they've got going on here in the Diocese of Southeast Florida. And next to him is Bishop Susan Goff, who has become the latest in the converts toward the mission of the ECBF, and how she has truly supported the work of the Building Fund, holding the first jumpstart in a diocese, and I'm sure that you're going to be hearing more about that as time goes on. We also have Bishop Sean Rowe, who, in addition to being the bishop of the diocesan bishop of northwestern Pennsylvania, is also the provisional bishop of the Diocese of Bethlehem, and he's also the chair of the Episcopal Church Building Fund. When I thought about that, northwestern Pennsylvania, and then at the extreme opposite end of the state is the Diocese of Bethlehem. And I thought it was kind of like when there used to be an East Pakistan and a West Pakistan before they made Bangladesh. And so I can't imagine what your travel schedule is, and I don't want to know. Next to him, you met Bishop Sutton earlier today at the Eucharist. Did I go past Smiley? Jeez. Well, Wyoming is a flyover state. That was cruel. Sorry, John. Bishop John Smiley from the Diocese of Wyoming, and some of the most beautiful country that you'll ever see anywhere. And some of the most faithful, people, I'm so amazed. I've been in the West. I was ordained in Utah, and the number of people in the East who complain about having to drive to go to church on Sunday. There are people who drive 50 and 60 miles to go to church on Sunday out in Wyoming, maybe even further. Thank you, John, for being here. Appreciate it. And then there's Bishop Sutton from the Diocese of Maryland, who has said on more than one occasion he wants to be remembered as the first green bishop of Maryland, and he's well on his way to doing that. And finally, Bishop Brian Thom from Idaho, also another one of those western states where it's a great distance to get from one place to another from time to time. And so the first question to anyone, outside of your own diocese, that's outside of your own diocese, what is the most exciting and hopeful church-related experience you have recently had? Not in your diocese. What is the most exciting and hopeful church-related experience you have recently had? Bishop Frade.
Actually, it's part of the Episcopal Church, but it's not in the continental United States. But one of the most exciting things I have seen, and it has been the work that the Bishop of the Dominican Republic is, Bishop Holguin, the advance of the church, the reaching people that are on church or related maybe with another church, but have abandoned that church for whatever reasons, through the schools, through the visitation, really non-apologetic proclamation of Jesus Christ as Savior, and bringing people and attracting people, and helping to make those churches as self-supporting as possible. In some areas it's so poor, but still the challenge is given to all of them. So for me, that when I come back, it's I think they have about 20 companion relationships. We're one of them. But when I come back from the Dominican Republic, I always come back energized with a tremendous hope of our church. And we have been able to also to receive some of the blessings. Some of the people have moved up in this neck of the woods, and they have brought that DNA, the DNA of being non-apologetic and proclaiming. We have right now a couple that came from the Dominican Republic. Actually, he was a Haitian that fell in love with a Dominican girl, and if you know her, you will understand why. But she is also a priest, and he is a priest. And he runs the French Creole congregation, and she runs the Spanish congregation. They have a Haitian Hispanic congregation that both worship in the same place, and they are really impacting the area where they where in the past that was not the case. And really, it's something that the DNA that is created that makes those people effective, and then somehow you get energized by them and hopefully get some of their DNA also.
Anyone else?
Yes.
Bishop Smiley.
We have developed a 5-diocese relationship around the world. We have Leicester from England, Kiteto and the Diocese of Mount Kilimanjaro in Tanzania. It's the Church of South India, and the 5 bishops from 4 continents met in South India. And we were, first of all, working on our relationship and how we can support one another. But the thing that was so extraordinary was we were taken out one day to a community where the folks who lived in that community were from the lowest caste. They were the washers of clothes. Historically, the women have typically been taken and made concubines for the landowners. And if the men would resist that, what was happening to the women, they would often be murdered. And as you know, the Hindu caste system is a fatalistic society, that one should accept one's fate, and if you do, you have a hope of a better life in the next time around. Seeing a church built in that context and then that community, and the joy and the liberation, the folks who now, instead of thinking their theology of a caste and acceptance and fatalism, beginning to understand themselves as brothers and sisters and friends with Christ, being a new creation. It just was extraordinary to see the liberation. And the women in particular who danced for us when we arrived, and danced and sang and basically told the story of our Lord in their language. Then they sought to sell us doormats, which the church had taught them to make. And the symbolism of these women who had been doormats, and now they were selling doormats, which actually the churches had taught them to make so they could avoid being concubines. Wow. And it was extraordinary, and it made me think of how much we take for granted the political liberation power. I mean, and just the power of identity and the power of the gospel. And, I find myself wondering how we can, in Wyoming, just re-engage that transforming understanding of identity that we have in Christ.
That's great. Bishop Pham.
I want to say something about where Scott and Eugene and I were a few weeks ago in Oklahoma City at the Reclaiming the Gospel of Peace conference. And I'm going to say something about that and then let you describe it, since Eugene was instrumental in getting it to occur. 280 people came together from across the Episcopal Church to begin an attempt to respond to the epidemic of gun violence in our country, organized by bishops from urban areas whose brothers and sisters are being punished by incredible gun violence. But for me, I went to try to attempt to find my Episcopal voice in social justice issues. And bravely went where a bishop from Idaho has never gone before. Because you can imagine, as you hear news about things from Idaho, that the weight of the gun lobby and the weight of ag business in Idaho is very, very large. We heard many proposals and got a lot of information about how to do legislative attempts and even gun language, so our vocabulary is appropriate for conversations. I must say I went away with a personal conviction, both around my Episcopal voice and what one might be able to do in a place like Idaho. But Eugene, I'd like you to describe how this came about.
Maybe in just a minute. It came about because 30,000 Americans are shot dead by firearms every year. 30,000. Another estimated up to 100,000 people in America are shot, which is to say, every 8 to 10 years, 1 million Americans are shot. That is a public health crisis of epidemic proportions. And that's why some of us got together and say, what can we as the church do something? Whenever there has been whenever there were epidemics in the past, yellow fever, cholera, churches got together to care for people and also to help prevent the deaths. I think we're called upon to do that again today. And so that was a wide-ranging group of folk. Bishops were invited to help plan it and attend from small dioceses, large, mostly rural, mostly urban, everything in between. It was not anti-gun, not anti-Second Amendment. Many firearm owners are there, but we just recognize that there has to be something to address that problem. There are some common sense things we can do, including legislation. One final thing. I gave an address to open the conference talking about the mythology of violence. And it's something we Americans especially have to deal with. It's in our DNA to solve problems by violence. We believe that's the answer. It is a myth, and ones who are followers of Jesus need to challenge that. The answer to more gun violence is not to arm everyone. That's an American answer that has not worked. And we need to protect the rights of firearm owners. We also need to protect the rights of people who are not armed. In our schools, in our everywhere. We challenge the belief that if everyone had firearms, we would be safer. It's a myth.
Doug.
Well, an experience of church outside of Western Massachusetts that I've had is the House of Bishops, the people gathered at this panel. You know, it's been since July of 2012 that I entered the House of Bishops, and they've just been tremendously welcoming. And they're also really progressive, forward-looking thinkers, which is wonderful. There's no nostalgia. It's not trying to go back to the church of the 1950s, which is great. I mean, it means that if you in this group, which is a bunch of innovative, creative thinkers, if you come up with something you want to do, the bishop's going to say yes. They're going to support you in that. They want the revolution to begin. And it's also a group, too, I think, that models hospitality and bringing in new people and cherishing their ideas. For some of us, not having a whole lot of experience as bishops, right away, you're welcomed in and people ask, what do you think about that? Sean Rowe, who was elected bishop right out of high school, he is already a leader in the House of Bishops, in charge of all kinds of committees. So I think it's a wonderful community.
Which leads right into the second question, which I think this is great. If any of you, if you could build a perfect church community from the ground up, what would it look like, and would it need a building? if you could build a perfect church community from the ground up, what would it look like, and would it need a building? Bishop Goff.
It would look like the downtown library in Richmond, Virginia, or any downtown library. The downtown library is used full-time. There's so many activities there. Classes, art classes, yoga classes, kids coming from the elementary schools to do programs there. Homeless people who go to get out of the cold or out of the heat and spend their time at the computers, reading books, learning. There's a hub of activity in the downtown public library all the time. And people of different races, languages, cultures, backgrounds. I just think it would be so cool to take that community and go with that community that's already there, or communities that converge there, and have worship in the public library as well, and build a worshiping community with that downtown cross-section and mix of people as a core. And would it need a building? Well, it's got a building. It's got a building that's used most days of the week, all the time anyway. So to use it for one more thing, so that it can really be a center of culture and life in downtown. I just think church in the library would be amazing.
So at a scale that's probably at the total opposite end of that spectrum, part of my reality in Nebraska is that about 25 or so of our 53 parishes are in vanishing rural communities and worship anywhere from 6 to 20 people on a Sunday morning. So, and they're fiercely devoted Christians in beautiful places, but they are dying. And one thing we've done a lot of work with in the last few years is, and this is nothing new, this is not rocket science, but we're talking a lot about discipleship groups and just very small church communities living into a handful of very fundamental disciplines about what it means to be a follower of Jesus and to really follow Jesus in a daily, authentic, bold kind of a way. And part of what that does for a place like, I don't want to name one of my places, there are cameras going, but a very small vanishing Nebraska town, is it turns what everybody thought was a crappy little church into a totally kick-ass discipleship community. You know, 10 or 12 people can be a phenomenal discipleship community, even if they can't be what we all still kind of think of as a church because of what we've inherited. And the other thing is discipleship groups translate to much larger church structures, of course. We all know that small groups are the heart of the matter for huge Christian communities. So, and I'll plug a book that a friend has just published that is a great primer for this and includes material in the back about how to organize and run a discipleship group. It's called The Restoration Project, and it's by Father Christopher Martin. You don't even need to teach this book. You can just hand it out and people will go with it.
Scott, I was starting to think, I think you had something to do with the Service Corps house that started in Omaha. And there are several other folks on the panel who have an Episcopal Service Corps group in their diocese. Would you see that as a model for whatever the church is becoming, that you say this discipleship group? Could it be modeled on that Service Corps house?
Yes, and others can say more. You know, in some ways, that's the discipleship group to the most extraordinary degree. You know, a residential Christian community of people often living in really underprivileged neighborhoods and doing a lot of that fundamental discipleship work in terms of serving precisely the neighborhood that they're located in and living in common, very simple lives. That's the DNA for most of the Episcopal Service Corps houses, and that is a really powerful thing, and certainly for folks just out of college, but increasingly for folks who are a little bit older and are looking for some new way to be a disciple. Yeah.
Bishop Sutton.
Ground up, a community of people who are just passionately in love with God and other people. I believe that maybe the single biggest thing that my beloved church lacks, the Episcopal Church, is enthusiasm about the gospel. There is a lack of confidence in the power of the gospel of Jesus Christ to change people's lives and communities. That lack of passion is killing us. And by the way, I don't mean Pentecostal necessarily, or clappy happy, which I'm happy to do. I'm a contemplative. I'm passionate about silence. But it pains me when I see clergy who are not passionate about God and their people. It pains me when laypersons are not passionate about the gospel. They believe it's about maintaining a structure of the church. So, passion to really experience, to be overflooded with the love of God, because behind all of the feeding programs, the growing, the gardening, the setting of spaces, is a passion for the souls of people. And without that passion, it ain't going to happen, because then we're another social service agency or something. We care for souls. We care for them because we love people. We love God. That's what I would do.
Number 3. As the death tsunami hits, dioceses will inherit closed church buildings. What do you see as the best alternate uses of our buildings? Because you're going to be the folks that are going to inherit these buildings. What are you going to do? Go ahead, Sean.
By the idea of death tsunami, it's the idea that by 2020 our death rate will go on a vertical. And if we look at the average age of people in our church, we're going to experience significant loss, and we'll have to make some tremendous growth jumps in order to simply maintain a level of membership. I'd like to see us get ahead of this curve. I'm not dodging the question, but I'd like to see us beat this curve by creating some scale, which I think is part of one of the issues that dogs us in the Episcopal Church, and I think a lot of mainline Protestantism, at least in the United States, and that is we don't have the scale to do what we need to do. We've got 100 domestic dioceses. We've got dioceses that are, even our largest dioceses barely have the scale to do what needs to be done. So I think that beginning to think about how we do it, and there are other ways to do it besides merging dioceses. I mean, that's one model, but there are other ways, as some of you are probably even more familiar with, to create scale in what we're doing. And the way that the buildings will be repurposed will largely be based on context. But still, I really have higher expectations of God than maybe the average Episcopalian. That God will do something. I'll say something more about this when I talk tomorrow. I don't want to start preaching. But I think it's for us to get ahead of this. Now, we were asking ourselves questions about this 15 years ago, and we weren't ready to hear it. And now the gig is up, as it were. And for a person for the people that live in northwestern Pennsylvania, which is largely depopulating, it's already over in terms of doing it the same way. But I think there's a way to get ahead of it. And I think that, again, the repurposing is based on context. It's hard to, my crystal ball isn't working so well today about the repurposing, but I think it will depend on where.
Bishop Fisher.
I'd agree with Sean that it's all based on context, and maybe some of that's how a diocese can help out, just like when a church does a search for a new priest in charge, a new rector, the diocese helps them in terms of finding it. I think we probably need to help our churches visualize what those buildings can be, but it's going to be on context. But I'd also agree with Sean that we always talk about dying, and maybe we need to back up from that a little bit. And so with the average age of an Episcopalian is about 64, I think, is it?
Right.
Okay, so let's back up a little bit from that. And let's say we're in our late 50s. I know something about late 50s. And so if you look at faith formation and life formation, each era has a different agenda to it, right? So for people in their 50s, the agenda is to avoid stagnation and to think about what your legacy will be. Not in the sense of building a monument, but how's the world going to be different because you were here. And so maybe in terms of a church, instead of talking about dying, maybe we should talk about the life task of people in their 50s. How can we avoid stagnation? How can we avoid doing the same thing over and over again? Because we got good at it. That's why we do it over and over again. We got good at it. But it's no longer meeting the needs of the world that we address. So how can we constantly avoid stagnation and think about how we might make a difference? And maybe later on we'll think about death.
Okay, maybe this will open up to some more answers about, in terms of if we have too many buildings, what are some of the things that we can do with those buildings? You're the visionaries now. It's going to be your responsibility. What are some of the things we can do with these buildings that will be in keeping with our gospel work, but may not look like it will not look like the church we grew up in? Bishop Goff.
I'm going to push back a little bit about the bishops being the visionaries. One of the things I said earlier in my workshop is, most of the time, I don't know what I'm doing. And when I first became a bishop, almost 2 years ago, that felt very frightening. And now I really embrace that, the being able to claim that half the time I don't know what I'm doing, because what that means to me is that there aren't fixed answers out there that we're just trying to uncover. We're creating the answers. And therefore, the vision needs to include the entire community. It needs to be the bishops. It needs to be the people in the local community. If a congregation calls Richmond, Virginia, and asks me or one of the other bishops, what are you going to do about us out here? Well, we go out there, and I'm sure we all do, and spend time with them, because apart from their particular context, any answer that we make is probably not going to make a lick of sense. So this work includes sharing the vision, not knowing the answers except in context, and by getting the whole community together, the stakeholders, the people who have left, the people that are passionate and energetic, people who know the community, and people who can see where are the gospel needs that the resources that the church has can help to address.
Thank you. Question number 4 is, oh, sure, Scott, go ahead.
First, I want to say I'm here partly to learn what in the world to do with the buildings. But the second thing I'd say from my context, and I know this is repeated up and down this table and throughout the diocese of the domestic church, in some ways it's the last idolatry around the buildings to think that they are worth anything. In a vanishing town, which is often where the churches are located, they're actually a liability, Nobody wants to buy them. You have to spend money to board them up and keep them and make sure they're not an attractive nuisance in a community. So that's just, I'm sure that's not the first time you all have heard that, but let's be real about it.
Even in the inner city, Scott.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be a small town in the city. Yeah. Who needs an old building? Done.
Question number 4. Bishop Sutton touched on briefly, I think, earlier, but I'd like to hear from maybe some others. In your opinion, what is the one ingredient our lay and ordained leaders lack, and how can we remedy that situation?
A high expectation of God. that God actually still works miracles, that God is still God. That's number one. I mean, we talk about entrepreneurial leaders and whatever else. The day is long. But what about having an expectation that God will act? Mm-hmm. I mean, I can't believe that third to half of the people in the United States aren't claimed by any faith tradition, but we're sitting here talking about having too many buildings. Mm. And how is that possible? On one hand. On the other hand, I understand the reality, but I think that can be remedied by us seeking God and raising our expectations that God will act.
Preach it.
Bishop Smiley.
I'll follow up, I think, in terms of what Eugene said earlier and also what Sean just said. I mean, I wrote a note to myself for this question, which is sustained passion. Mm. And by that, and I think to have sustained passion, you need to dig into the power of God or open up to the power of God. Let the power of God flow through to engage the Holy Spirit. So I think we're all on the same page on this one.
Bishop Thom.
I recall a seminary experience, a middler year, going into my advisor and elucidating everything that was wrong with all my classmates and professors, and as you can imagine, and he said 4 words to me: God has not changed. And I remember that every time I get in a race where we're whining and talking about either the reality of things and the rest of it. So it gets on to, having enough trust and faith. But I wanted to make it more personal, and the answer I wrote down is the one ingredient the bishop lacks is to believe in the resurrection. The one thing this bishop lacks is sufficient belief in the resurrection. I pray that I will climb on the crosses I need to climb onto, or if I'm thrown on one, I might understand it then and find my way out. It's personal. It's personal.
Bishop Frade and then Bishop Goff.
I would say that one of the things that I see is that one of the things that lay people and the clergy lack is permission. Permission to fail, permission to just go ahead and do things. A lot of times, I kept telling the clergy when I first came in here, listen, it's easier for me to be able to forgive you than to give you permission. So just go ahead and do it, and let's see how. The ability to fail, or the ability, or even to take chances when other people say, no, this is not the way it's done, or this is not the Episcopal way, or this is not the correct way that we have not been doing it in here, and I would say that goes for the clergy, but also for the lay people. We are, as clergy, I think, in general, we're afraid of our lay people, in either that they're going to take over or they're too overpowering or whatever. Just let them loose. I mean, what the hell are you going to lose?
Yeah, let's plan some shit.
Yeah. I mean, let them go out there, and we have to, train and retrain and make sure that everybody's going to be theologically correct. A few heresies here and there won't hurt anybody. It has never hurt in the past. And the reality is that we just need to be able to let our church go. I mean, take the chains away and let us see what happens, because what we know is that what's happening right now is nothing, and it's better to just go out and start allowing things experiment and be able to provide the people that we live around with something that it's It's there. It's better than not providing them with anything.
I think that you have perfectly described what Parker Palmer says about God creating out of chaos, that it's that kind of chaos that he says every organization and every person from time to time needs to be returned to chaos in order to be reborn or to have some new life emerge that the Holy Spirit can work with. And I think that's a perfect description of what Parker Palmer says. Bishop Goff.
I would add, sort of along the same lines, but one of the things that I see our clergy and lay leaders, the strong lay leaders, not having enough of is time. And see clergy just absolutely exhausted from the daily work, and lay leaders, the active lay leaders, exhausted from their daily work in the world and in the church both. And so that the kind of things that we're talking about, the kind of contextualized creative thinking, is impossible when you're exhausted. You just can't be creative when you're exhausted. And I think what we as a church need to do is, almost sounds counterintuitive, but is to regain a sense of Sabbath. Maybe in Lent, not do one more program, but do less programming so that we can enter the wilderness, have space there, find God there, reconnect with God there, be refreshed and be renewed to go forth and do the work that we've been called to do.
The next question, and it's the final question that was prepared, and the next will be up to you to ask the questions. So, to the bishops, if you were queen for a day, or king, what top 3 institutional sacred cows would you change, not hold so tightly, or jettison from our church world? Bishop Frade.
Well, the first sacred cow I will go after is the seminaries. I would say that I would teach less theology and more plumbing and electricity. Because, especially how to work a toilet. That's, you know, but the reality is that in many ways it's really not so much their fault. We need to learn that. We need to learn the Bible. The thing is that when I got out of seminary and I went to the best seminary there is, the University of the South in Swanee, God's holy name. But
Yawn.
I know there are other Bible schools out there that are pretty good, but the reality is that I learned, you know, I had very good Old Testament professors, New Testament professors, but what I really never learned is how to run a Bible study with the people and how to be able to disciple those people. So I think that there has to be more of that practical thing, and then of course the hours that I had to spend to learn how to do the parochial report, and which are, you know, there are many things that we learned that I haven't used yet. And I'm sure that eventually I will use them because I bet maybe there will be a question and answer when I get to heaven. But the reality is that will be the number one. But then after that is the structure. When people leave seminary, our people go, the Episcopalians, I know there are others, but I would say that I would probably guess that happens to you too. They leave seminary, they come and say, well, Bishop, where are you going to send me? I would like to create a structure where the people will leave seminary and say, Bishop, I'm going to open a mission over here, and I'm going to be able to develop the ministry over here, that they don't have to just, like I did, you know, I went to my bishop and said, where are you going to send me? Over there? Okay, then I went, and that's fine. I was not that happy with what they sent me, but still, I was going to do it. I am an obedient servant. But the thing is that the structure, as we see it with other denominations, is that we are perpetuate the same thing over and over again by feeding the same. And I think that there has to be, for us as a structure, as bishops, to be willing to say, okay, go and do it. Oh, no, the person cannot go there. You have to put them with another person to train him or her. The question is that, that him or her can barely pay his or her salary, and we're expecting to put another person in that place to train. So we really, I think that we need to, from the time they're in seminary, be prepared to be able to make the church grow, and to also, and not so much to just replanting in the same place, but let's germinate in other areas. And the third, I'll let for somebody else.
Okay.
Okay.
We're looking for what you would change, not hold so tightly, or jettison from our church world. Bishop Fisher.
Well, one would be something of an attitude, and that's, one of my spiritual heroes is Thomas Merton, and as I went from the Roman Church to the Episcopal Church, Thomas Merton went from the Episcopal Church to the Roman Church, and if you would have read his Seven-Story Mountain in the 1930s, he said that the reason he left the Episcopal Church was because it was too fussy. And so I would jettison anything that looks like fussiness and deal with really meaningful things, which I think we're called to do. The second thing I think I would jettison is, again, in terms of an attitude, is to really passionately, as was brought up before, passionately speak about God and about social justice. Rob Hirschfeld, who's the Bishop of New Hampshire, and he's the 10th Bishop of New Hampshire, when he was elected, he got a call from Doug Thurner, and Doug Thurner calls him and says, Rob, this is number 8, calling number 10, and my only advice to you is don't be timid. Don't be timid. So that's another attitude I think I would hope for us to change. And the third one, which might be along the lines of a sacred cow, is that it's my bounden duty as part of the quick and the dead to say that maybe the time for Rite One is past. That perhaps it could be that Rite One is not a church growth type of prayer. But maybe that might just be me.
Or could that be, as the Reverend Dr. Duggan said, could that be part of the hospice ministry that we're called to? Just a thought. Anyone else want to tackle some sacred cows?
Yeah, just a little pushback. I don't think Rite One's a problem. That's probably maybe a third of Episcopalians are worshiping in Rite One, the 8 a.m. And other. At least in my part of the world, the early service and the great Episcopalians. Sacred cow, I'd go after. Obviously, there are a number of things, but one is music. Music. I'm married to a musician. She's has a large program at St. Albans Church in Washington. Very classically trained. She's wonderful at it. And that church manages to grow by traditional music. So I'm not really talking about type of music. I'm saying good music. As bishops, oh boy, you colleagues, my colleagues, you know this, we visit places. And I would get rid of half the choirs. That's a sacred cow. Try doing that. But I did when I was in the parish. You have to get rid of some of your organists and piano players. I love organ music. I love piano music. But if you hear what we hear when we travel around, people who cannot play, they cannot play. They're just not good at that. And so we think, just on a very practical level, when visitors come and they are cringing, and everybody's cringing, I suggest that has a deleterious effect on people attracted to the Episcopal Church. Here's my encouragement. Lay leaders and rectors, think about if you don't have someone who can play the piano or organ well, think we're not going to do that unless we do. Guitars and others they're not automatically the solution. I've witnessed some guitar choirs or praise bands that were terrible. That's not necessarily. But others, like this morning, they were good. And good music adds to the quality of it. There are perfectly fine liturgical expressions, worship services, that don't require keyboards and don't require an anthem. Just the last thing on that while I'm on the subject. The offering, some of you know, I think that I say that the offering, the offertory, should be the funnest part of the Eucharist. It is that sacred act of giving and joyful response, and yet 90% of the time in many of our churches, the offering is the most somber, funereal music. Who died? There's no movement. There's nobody smiling. Nobody, and he said, won't you give? And it is the deadest part of the service. Music.
Bishop Thom.
On my list, hard to hold the three. I was with, and the Twitter feeds are off, right?
Yeah, Twitter's
good.
broken. We broke Twitter.
Because if you repeat some of the things we've just said to our people, actually, I'm not kidding.
Little late, Brian.
Leo, my solution might be, I think we should give up the sacred cow of seminarian debt. Because evidently we believe that all seminarians should have debt because we've not solved that problem. Because it would allow all of my seminarians to come back to Idaho. Because Idaho has not kept a seminarian in 20 years. Because they can't afford to come work for us. I also might give up stipendiary cure. I also might give up paid clergy. The worker tent maker model is interesting to me. Apropos, I had already written this down, Bonnie, but actually I would give up Episcopal bishop vestments. Oh, well, that was already on my list. It was already on my list. Now listen, did you just listen to us moan? Some of us.
Some moaned.
No, I just, I have the most beautiful vestments of any of my colleagues. And yet, and some of you, I don't know if any of you were, Sean was there at the consecration on Saturday. And it was a lovely photograph of the 7 of you bishops lined up. Yeah. And I just wondered if that was in the public press, what the people who don't go to church would wonder of that, what I consider to be liturgical artistic beauty, but it's difficult. It's difficult. And when I walk down the aisle in one of the churches that my brother just described, in those vestments, which are worth more than anything inside that room. But the thing I might really want to give up, and even though I love being one and thought it was the best job in the world, I would give up rectorships. The sanctity of the rectorship in the Episcopal Church does nothing but promote congregationalism. And for mission imperative, I wish that I paid all the priests and that they are all at my mission disposal, meaning at our mission disposal for the mission of the diocese in our region. I love the protection I had when I was one, but now I see in places that are trying to hang on and that who define themselves by having a rector, not a vicar, that it's problematic. And that I can't, and when, as we were discussing also at lunch, and you're talking about priests who don't have the passion and the chutzpah, if I have one of those as a rector, I cannot move them. I can't budge them because their congregation is codependent with them. So I might be willing to give that up, even though I consider it one of the great checks and balances of our Episcopal system.
For softball answers. You dodged that question.
Thank you, Bishop Thom. Living proof that in the Rocky Mountains, where the air is thin, oxygen starvation can bring out the truth.
I'm just glad you didn't say tenure of bishops.
Bishop Friday, did you have another? Could you give him the microphone, Doug? Thanks.
I just recalled the third cow that was evading me, but the sacred cows, yeah. One of the things that I would love to disappear from our churches, if possible, at least from the ones here in Southeast Florida. I know there's some witnesses here, but it's really to be able to get rid of our pews that would allow us to be able to have a better use of our building. But I realize that it's easier to deny the divinity of Christ than tell somebody that we're going to get rid of the pews. It really is something that keeps that is so archaic and against the proper use to be able to use the building. The other one is the red doors. And I know somebody told me if you see an Episcopal church that's going to have a red door. In our cathedral, we didn't have red doors, but one thing we did have was just very strong, sturdy doors. Like, say, it doesn't matter how much you try to get in here, like hell you're going to get into this church. It was a nice fort, and we have been able, actually, since we put glass that people can look inside, it's incredible the amount of people that are just walking by. We're actually in an area that is reviving. And the amount of people that look inside, and we do have a beautiful church inside, with the exception of the pews. But it's really, for the first time, people are able to see what was that in that fort that we had there. So I think that it makes it more attractive. And at least with that one, was only a few battles. But we lost the battle of the pews, so we still have our pews. Don't sit on the third pew because your ass gets trapped because it's broken, and you'll have to be very careful with it. But otherwise, that's it.
And we were worried that we were going to call this plant some shit and get in trouble. Wow. Bishop Friday, to your point about the pews and the chairs, Bill Tully was the rector. He retired from being rector at St. Bartholomew's on Park Avenue in New York City. The last thing that he did there before retiring was to take out the pews and put in chairs. What he said to me when I sent him a donation for a chair, because I thought that was the best news I'd heard for a long time, Bill said that in his 35 years of ordained ministry, that was the hardest thing he ever did. And yet, there were some people who were staunchly opposed to it, but came back to him afterwards and said, you know, because we took out those pews, you've gotten rid of 92 years of dust that had built up and dirt, that because they cleaned all the tile, and they said, my gosh, this is healthier for us to breathe. And the choir, which had been opposed to it, came out and said, the acoustics are so much better, we sound terrific. Absolutely. Amazing how that happens. So, just the one thing that, Scott, you have one thing?
Oh, sure.
3 things?
Yeah, no, I'll go fast. First, I would note for the Episcopalians that this is not an unusual sort of conversation for your bishops to be having. Of course, there's some curmudgeons in the House of Bishops, but I think you would be astonished and delighted by the depth of faithfulness and prayerfulness that abounds when we get together. I guarantee you we will not be the ones who stop these problems from being solved. But on that score, I'd like to go after the national church for a moment. And
that's an easy one.
I would, yeah, well, but somebody's got to say it. Yes, the international church, the mission society. We should cut. We should limit church assessments, diocesan assessments to 10% or something. Nebraska pays 17 foolishly. Our general convention is just sprawling and insane, and it should be half the size and half the length. And I don't know why we have provinces. The only good reason people articulate is that certain regions can get organized to do what they need to do at general convention, and I know that's accurate, but that doesn't help Nebraska much, and it just props up the whole general convention thing. So let's get rid of all that. That's enough.
Well, I'm glad these were all softball questions. They were able to hit them out of the park pretty well. So, any questions? And we'll come to you. But while we're waiting for someone to show their hand, I just want to tell you my one thing that I want to change is the sign. The Episcopal Church welcomes you, because most churches don't. And what I would, because every congregation that I go into, they all say that they're a welcoming congregation, and they haven't had a new member in 10 years. I want to get that sign changed that says the Episcopal Church, come change us. Right over here.
Okay, the Partners for Sacred Places based in Philly did a study called Halo Effects of Sacred Places. And what they basically found is that for churches who had well over half of the people coming in every week, if they were not members, those were the healthy churches. Because they were there for other reasons. The second thing they found is that the most wasted space is the sanctuary. Pointless, overdone, pews. And I think of two that changed. One was Holy Apostles in New York City that nearly died and said, no, we ought to be a soup kitchen. And now are the biggest feeder in New York City. And the second is Old Cambridge Baptist Church in Harvard Square, where the sanctuary is now a dance studio. Yeah, they use it Sunday to worship, as does Holy Apostles. What
Your question is?
My question is, for your diocese, who meets that standard? Tell me about a church that's a sacred place where the halo effect is really working.
Well, while they're thinking about that, I will say, as I see Bill Parnell sitting next to you, he's the Archdeacon in New York. In the Diocese of New York, where I was before I went to Maryland, I was vicar of a congregation in Montgomery, and the entire square footage of the building was 1,870 feet, and that included the nave and the parish hall. The reason that church was kept open is because it had 23 12-step meetings a week in that building. And when the meeting got too big for the parish hall, which was like really a big living room, they would move it into the sanctuary and use the sanctuary. And so that church is doing a ministry well beyond the 18 people that show up on Sundays. And that's the kind of ministry that I think that is going to be the future of the church in terms of being the indispensable community asset that Julie Groom talked about on Monday night. That's the kind of gospel work that we can be doing. That's in the Diocese of New York. Bishops, anything come to mind?
Tom, can you take 15 seconds and unpack this idea of the halo effect as it relates to churches, and then kind of what is the point of your question? I mean, what are you really asking?
Well, the halo effect, as just an example of AA groups, but choral societies, symphonies, daycare. Somebody this morning talked about a Saturday morning they had coffee, and I said, well, why don't you just rent the whole parish hall out all week to Starbucks and really have them all come in? That's the Richmond Library. All of our spaces are useful in lots of ways, which are there for those who we are asked to serve. So what I'm asking from your diocese is for an example of a parish that has discovered that its reason to exist and its reason for its building is to have others come and use it for all of the reasons that communities need it.
Sure, a great example in Western Massachusetts would be the cathedral itself, which is in downtown Springfield and has numerous social programs throughout the week and feeds a couple hundred people for lunch and dinner. Has numerous programs for after-school learning. Would be a great example of that.
It's, you have to realize that in Wyoming, we have 550,000 people in the entire state, 97,000 square miles, the diocese. But let me tell you about a little church in Dixon, population 78. They have 20 people in church, and they run an after-school program. You know, our churches, we don't have very many professional clergy. We are mostly locally ordained, though we are part of a local ordination program now that is the Iona School, and the results of folks who go through the Iona School are often better than those who go through seminary in terms of the general ordination exams. But I feel that it's really important for those of you in the East to recognize that there are really different contexts. And what might be successful in one place doesn't look the same in another. But I will say that in Wyoming, we are very mission-oriented. The fact of our presence in these little towns and finding ways to sustain that presence is a mission and a witness.
And thank you for saying that, John. I agree completely. And that's why it's hard to make some blanket statements. In point of fact, some of our churches are of such, they're in strategic areas, they look beautiful, they need to have glass doors, and the success of that isn't that something else is going on in that nave during the week. It is thought to be a holy space where people can go and pray. That's not going to be the solution everywhere. They have it other ways, but there's nothing inherently wrong with the holy hotspot not being used for other purposes during the week.
And one other comment on that I wanted to make is that part of my message in Wyoming when I'm in congregations is please remember that you are the church when you're not in church. And so that really when we're in the building and gathered in worship, it's to be strengthened to be the church in the world.
What do you think can be done to make more palatable for entrenched congregations the notion that if a church does not have a mission beyond keeping its own doors open, that perhaps is a good sign that that church either needs to find a mission or allow itself to die?
I find that Bible study can open up a lot for people. And I've seen this happen a couple of times. I mentioned one in the sermon. Rather than the bishop or the canon for evangelism or something saying, here's what you ought to do, here's what you ought to do, open up the sacred scriptures and say, let's spend some time, maybe an hour this evening, and then maybe for 7 weeks, and let's just read it in kind of Lectio style, and then it's what is the Spirit saying to you personally in your life, and what is the Spirit saying to your community? It's amazing what comes up, what bubbles up from so-called below when people are given permission to let the Spirit come up, and it's a lot better than the expert coming in and saying, here's what you ought to do. People can figure it out if they allow the space.
You know, too, that several dioceses have done, starting with Bible study, and then sent out groups in 4 different directions. And they invited people to go north, south, east, and west, walking 20 minutes from their church. And just looking at what's there, just being aware. You know, it's as many times as Jesus said love in the scriptures, he said wake up. And so to just do that, to walk the neighborhood and see what those needs are.
This is to all the bishops. I'm Jim Belmont from Malden, Massachusetts. I was going to say Boston, but what would you do with a priest in your diocese who would not let a Bible study group get started?
Control issues.
Control issues. Thank you, Bishop.
I hear that happens in Massachusetts.
Well, I'm glad we have a diverse group here. Maybe they can come into the conversation. Thank you.
I didn't answer the Queen for a Day question, but you know, I see so many things like that just confound me. And I think it boils down to people not realizing how truly beloved they are of Jesus. You know, so many of the battles, so many of the inexplicable decisions seem to always boil down to this sense of fear and needing to be protected and not having just the simple being on that foundation of I'm okay. I don't have to control anything. I don't know why, but if I were Queen for a Day, I'd somehow help everybody know how much Jesus loves them, and I think a multitude of sins would be covered by that.
And if that doesn't work, what we found is that we go around that person. Now, it sounds a little bit crass, but it's in my diocesan staff, it is our mission that in every position in the diocese to have relationships with as many people as we can in every congregation, meaning that my accountant has relationships with treasurers, or when their secretary calls my secretary to figure out how to do the procure report, that we constantly are building relationships at all levels, because I promise, because this has become true, that eventually that issue will come out, and a parishioner who wishes they could have a Bible study will say something in passing to my secretary, who then shares that at staff meetings, and then the canon, whoever, and I, and we gain entree that way, and then we work to empower the person in the context, to raise it up, and then the rector will think it's their idea. It's all about relationships, but also dealing that. We're not called to have relationships only with the clergy.
Last question.
As the foreigner in the crowd, I wanted to bring a perspective on the halo effect question that I learned from our cousins across the pond. If you haven't seen the report that the Church of England released last summer on church growth, you owe it to yourself to find it and read it. It's stunning. They've discovered that in the last 10 years, since they really began the mission-shaped church effort, they have added close to 60,000 adherents to the church. None of them are in traditional parishes. There are two sources of growth. One is what they call fresh expressions of church, which are usually rooted in the parish church, but don't necessarily meet there. It might be a house church, it might be a kids' play thing. That's the kind of halo effect, but it's not other groups coming in to do it. It's them doing it in order to take the gospel out to the people who haven't heard it yet. And the other place, which is stunning, is cathedrals. Cathedrals in Britain are growing. People need liminality. People need beauty. And the other thing is that people need a low commitment entry. They can show up, get top-notch preaching, top-notch music, top-notch program, and go home after an hour. But it's a way to get people in the door. The report, I can't remember the name of it, one of the primary authors, From Anecdote to Evidence. George Lings is the primary guy from the Sheffield Center, the Church Army Research Center. It's really important what they're learning. And part of it is, it's all about a relentless witness to Jesus Christ. That's the ground.
And the title again, Anecdote
From Anecdote to Evidence.
Thank you.
David, what you just said recalls an answer that Ron gave last night for why did you do the gardens? Notice his answer was really two things. It was love and beauty. First, love. People are dying in my community. And so I wish I could have him speak before a number of our vestries. People are dying in my community, so I decided to do something about that. What a question for vestries to ask. Are people dying in your communities? What can you do? The second thing, he says, I wanted to see something beautiful. And why can't our churches do that too? If it's a simple room or if it's a great Gothic cathedral, beauty actually matters. It matters if there's trash all around, outside and inside the church. It matters if it's cluttered. It matters if it doesn't look like nobody's paid attention to that. And what we do ought to be beautiful. It ought to be beautiful. I was just struck by that, as a church growth way also in England. Love and beauty. Love it.
I just want to thank the bishops. I think that they were more candid than I expected them to be. I appreciate your directness, and if Scott, your description is this goes on at House of Bishops is accurate, then that certainly changed, because there's so much secrecy there seems to be around the House of Bishops and how it meets, and the fact that the communications coming out of there has been so circumspect in the past. That's good news. And if this is an example of the conversations you have in the House of Bishops, I'm going to walk out of here encouraged today. So thank you.